Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Farming is about preparing for or reacting to the weather which is thrown at us from year to year. This year it seems the notion of weather coming in larger blocks seems to be ringing through. From the start of the year it was either too dry for long periods or now very wet. And October was very wet, with Dublin recording 123% more rainfall than normal, with Moore Park and Cork recording over 200%. November has continued in the same vein with scarcely a dry day yet. This has delayed planting in many areas past the ideal time, and subsequently quite a number of crops were planted into wetter and colder soils. Crops were slower to emerge, and the torrential rain over the past couple of weeks has left standing water in many fields, resulting in significant damage. Due to the wet conditions, soil pests such as leather jackets and slugs in particular are more problematic in many fields. Assessing populations and control can be tricky, especially when conditions continue to be very wet. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran Collins, a Tillage Specialist in Teagasc, to talk about the best options for crops which are at risk from these pests. Ciaran, it's been very wet over the past month or month and a half, and this has been particularly hard on crops. How are crops in general faring, and especially the crops that have been sown about 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, Michael, I suppose firstly, there hasn't been a huge amount of sowing going on, as you mentioned. It's just for the last month and a half. It's been quite wet. Now there has been little bits gone in here and there, and I suppose those crops generally have suffered in terms of the rainfall after. Obviously, rolling wouldn't have been done because it wouldn't have been suitable, but there certainly are bits of missing patches in fields. Now look, the earlier sown are generally fine, but I think it's those more recent ones that we're seeing bits of crop damage, wet spots, or where water was lying in fields for a prolonged period of time, really. And I suppose we are seeing maybe just little bits of slug damage cropping up here and there as well.
Okay, we might get on to that in a second, but just in terms of the waterlogging that you mentioned there, kind of in the wet spots, is there also a factor in terms of ground cooling down a bit, as would generally happen this time of the year?
Yeah, I mean, we're the 17th of November today. I mean, if you were sowing, say, 3-4 weeks ago, you obviously had very warm, very high soil temperatures. You were getting rapid establishment. I mean, some of the crops were up in 10, 14 days, whereas, crops more recently sown obviously are taking that bit longer with cooler soils. Interestingly, though, the Met-Éireann data would still indicate that soil temperatures from the 9th to the 15th of November are actually still above normal. So I suppose that is some help. But I suppose the other side of it then is when you look at soil moisture deficits or the lack of it, obviously at this stage, well-drained soils, even well-drained soils, are at field capacity at this stage. So I suppose that's just giving us an indication of the impact that the rainfall has had recently.
So there probably is a bit of an interaction there, Ciaran, around the slightly, even though soils are slightly warmer on average for the time of year, they're still cooler than it would have been maybe a month ago. And then you put the wet or really wet conditions now on top of that. It probably does delay emergence that little bit more, does it? And does that give, you mentioned slugs, soil pests and that, a little bit more of an advantage?
Oh, of course it does. Yeah. What we're trying to do is get crops established and away from any pest problems, really. And obviously, the longer that duration is, the more chance it does give pests. And I mean, if conditions were suitable and you were sowing today, you could expect that crop to take between 4 and 6 weeks to emerge. So I suppose that's the big difference, really. And I suppose you're getting into more difficult seed beds at this time of year. You're going to more clods, which obviously favors pests again, and you wouldn't be able to roll generally at this time of year. So, sowing from now on is certainly going to be very, very difficult and challenging.
Okay. And I suppose just along in terms of, you mentioned slugs earlier, have you heard much problems out there of slugs or slug damage?
I think it's more localized issues. We're certainly seeing, as I said earlier, those earlier crops have been up and away, but certainly crops or fields, I should say, where there's been a previous history of slugs would be certainly one. Heavier or more later sown. They're generally the ones that you're finding problems in. I would say overall, it's a small proportion of crops, but it's significant for those that have it. And I suppose we are seeing, I suppose there's kind of almost 3 types of slug damage. You'll see the classic, the shredding of the leaves over ground, which is very easily to identify. And Then, sometimes, especially those later sown crops, you're finding, the crop didn't emerge, and when you root, you can find actually a hollowed out seed. But a quite common one just more recently is almost like leather jacket type symptoms, where you're finding these yellow leaves, and when you pull them up, they've actually been grazed below the surface. And, we've identified slugs in a lot of those cases as well. So there's sort of three types of damage really that we're looking at the minute.
Yeah, and all of those three can be pretty significant. And I suppose to add maybe a little bit to your in the scenarios where, if slugs have been a problem in the past in your field, but they probably can crop up here and now, here and there as well. In a situation, I've talked to some people locally there, where there was oilseed rape and maybe the sowing was delayed a little bit. That's certainly a place where slugs can be a bigger factor. And I've heard not just this year, but last year as well, where oats, where the straw from oats from last year was chopped in, seems to be more slugs in those conditions as well.
Yeah, there's certainly risk factors, there's no doubt. And then when you put delayed sowing on top of that and the weather we've had recently, you can end up with a fair problem.
And tell me, how does a farmer, what's the best way a farmer can go about assessing the slug numbers? Or is there, when you maybe take into those risk factors, is there a time somebody should be kind of saying, geez, I better start having a look to see, rather than kind of waiting for the 4 to 6 weeks and then scratching the head kind of thinking, still no sign of that crop there, maybe I should do something?
I know I'm going to be like a broken record here, Michael, but every time I come on, I seem to end up with the same suggestion, and that's walk crops, get into the crops, have a look. There's no substitute, and you can see a crop from the road and you can think, oh, look, it's coming up fine. But when you actually get into it is when you can really, really assess, So I think, we should get out into all crops regularly at this time of year, and assess pest damage in general. Like slugs are nocturnal, so they're gonna work at night. So if you suspect a problem in the field, like you said there, Michael, after maybe chopped straw or oilseed rape being a previous crop or a bit of history, set up some slug traps and try and assess the population there. So if someone's setting up a slug trap, it's quite simple. Look, an upturned plant pot saucer is ideal, or even a slate, just maybe slightly raised off the ground, covering about maybe 25-30 centimeter of a diameter. Put a bait in there. Chicken layers, mash, muesli works quite well. Don't use slug pellets, I suppose, really. And I suppose the key thing is then lay them out in maybe a W format across the field, like you would if you were soil sampling. And then put them out maybe during the day, and then check them in the morning before the sun gets down on it, because they tend to, the heat from the sun, if they're in the trap, it tends to put them back down underground because they're nocturnal. So again, maybe get out early in the morning and check and just see what kind of numbers you have. So the threshold that you'd have, say, for cereals would be 4 per trap. That's 4 on average, so you'll obviously get parts of the field that you might get higher or lower, but 4 on average would be the threshold where you might say, okay, I need to treat at this stage.
Okay. And when you talk about treatment with slug pellets, what's the options for slug pellets out there?
I suppose there's 2 options in terms of slug pellets. We have the metaldehyde formulations and we have ferric phosphate. So they're the 2 main active ingredients. They're wheat flour or pasta base. Now there are, I suppose, differences in the processes and in how they're formulated. There's wet and dry process, there's a steam process, there's a wet extrusion process. So, there are differences between slug pellets, certainly. And just the other one that we're talking about, slug pellets and application, is to be just aware of buffer zones, and especially, if near any water courses or drains or that, we're physically putting them down with an applicator, they will go quite a distance. And I suppose as well, we generally don't have slug problems on headlands because, the ground tends to be that little bit tighter. And if there is no damage on those headlands, just keep out, skip the headland, and just to make sure really that we, that we don't get physical contact or slug pellets getting into water courses.
Yeah. And in terms of, you mentioned the two, the metaldehyde and ferric phosphate, is there, from a scientific point of view, is there much of a difference? Are they in around the same, or where would you assess them?
Yeah, the research would suggest that there's no difference between ferric phosphate or the metaldehyde in terms of controlling slugs. There's a good bit of work done in the UK, and it would suggest that there's no difference. I suppose farmer perception is a different thing though, because with the metaldehyde products, the slugs tend to die on the surface. So when a farmer spreads slug pellets today, you'll see the dead ones on the surface, and that's evidence, obviously, that it has worked. With the ferric phosphate, they tend to go underground to die. So you use your ferric phosphate and you don't see dead slugs on the surface, and people might interpret that as being, well, it didn't work. Really, with ferric phosphate, it's the level of feeding or is what we should assess really. Has the damage stopped? And I suppose that's really the key one there. And I suppose the other point to make just about application as well is in terms of the rate. So if we're looking for control and we've got a bad slug problem, you need to get up near the full recommended rate of the individual products. So the research would show that you'd need about 60 pellets per square meter if there's a bad problem, So again, if you're going to reduce the rate, you're reducing the number of baiting points per square meter, and you may not get adequate control. So the number of baiting points is crucial. If you've got a bad problem, it's better to do the full rate once rather than a half rate twice, almost, in some scenarios, because you need that high level of baiting points, I think around 60 or that.
And is there any effects then of the weather after application in terms of rainfall or getting too dry, or what's the best conditions for those pellets to work? And I suppose on the other side of it, what's the worst conditions where they mightn't last that long?
Rain, yeah, they will break down quite quickly. The metaldehyde breaks down into CO2 and H2O in a few very short steps. So I suppose, again, if you're planning to put them out, have a look at the forecast. You'd ideally need maybe 48 hours dry, because they do break down. The hardness of the pellet obviously is an important factor in the accurate distribution, but also the process and how the pellet was formulated can influence as well how quickly it breaks down. But certainly wet weather will be the biggest factor. So, I would obviously avoid putting them out if there's rainfall in the forecast.
And if there is a heavy infestation and you are going out with this full rate, and let's just say you stuck it on a Monday, you got this 48 hours and you thought, geez, that's great, job done. What's the process just in terms of going back again, or do you need to go back, or do you kind of think that's finished, or what would the next steps be to make sure that the control is as you wanted the control to be?
Yeah, again, it's getting back into the field and having a look, I suppose, after 3 or 4 days. Firstly, you're going to see whether, if you use the metaldehyde ones, you're going to see the level of slugs that you've controlled. And then it's coming back and sees that damage continuing. And I suppose, unfortunately, our experience in recent years has been where we have bad slug problems, sometimes you do need to reapply. As I said, they do tend to break down quite quickly, which is obviously a factor, but if you do get very high numbers, or, as I say, our experience has been that you may need to go back. So assess the crop damage again. Is there fresh damage? Maybe you need to set up traps again and just see, is there slugs causing damage? And I suppose really the critical growth stage is kind of that early tillering growth stage, 21. So once the crop gets to that stage, the plant stems tend to be a bit thicker. They tend to do less damage there, and the plant is able to withstand the damage at that stage.
Okay, you grow away from it at that stage. I suppose maybe on the other side of it then is slugs are obviously a problem, but they mightn't be the only pest in the soils out there. And if a farmer is seeing damage to crops out there, but really can't find any slugs, what other thing out there is likely to be of concern?
I suppose slugs will be the main one at this time of year, as you say, Michael. I suppose, look, crows can be obviously a factor, and we can pretty much easily identify crow damage, and I suppose that's obviously after crops are sown is going to be the most likely time there. while leather jackets would normally be, more of an issue due to their life cycle in the spring, we have seen occasions where leather jackets have been there in the autumn as well. So again, I suppose it's about getting a spade out, digging around where the damage is in the field and see, like, is it slugs, is it leather jackets, or what's causing the problem there. But, slugs will be the number one at this time of year normally, crows obviously to some extent, and then possibly leather jackets, even though mainly the damage with leather jackets would be in the spring.
And any control measures for leather jackets if there was pockets of them there?
Unfortunately not. No, there is no chemical control really. Leather jackets, it's all about, the IPM measures of rolling, rapid crop establishment and that. So it's kind of the earlier sowing really is the main thing there.
Probably a double-edged sword, but get a few crows in, it'd probably be a great way trying to get rid of them if you could at all.
Well, they'll attract crows anyway, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, probably help. Listen, Ciaran, that's great. It probably gets through to some of the heart of why some crops are probably struggling out there and maybe not getting to the stage where farmers would like them. So again, Ciaran, thanks very much, and we'll be delighted to have you back again.
No problem. Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks again to Ciaran for joining me on the podcast. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.